You can buy a house in America for $50,000. Full house. Not a down payment. An actual complete house. So why isn't everyone doing it? Why aren't there lines of investors buying them up? Why do these houses stay on the market for months, sometimes years? Because cheap houses aren't cheap for a reason. Today, I'm showing you the real reasons nobody wants them. And trust me, it's more brutal than you'd think. Before we dive in, subscribe because at the end I'm breaking down the one scenario where buying a cheap house actually makes financial sense. And most people miss it completely. Let's go. This is the real estate paradox nobody talks about. You can find houses for $40,000, $60,000, $80,000 in America. Meanwhile, people are paying $800,000 for a home in California, $600,000 in New York, fighting over properties, bidding 50% over asking price. So logically, shouldn't cheap houses be a gold mine? Shouldn't savvy investors be buying them in bulk? The answer is complicated and honestly depressing. Because cheap houses are cheap because they're fundamentally broken. The location is broken. The economics are broken. The community is broken. That's why they're cheap. Let me explain. The core problem. The number one reason cheap houses are cheap: there are no jobs. This isn't theoretical. This is fundamental economics. People follow money. If a city has lost 50% of its population over 30 years, it's because the jobs left. Manufacturing moved overseas. The coal mines closed. The factory relocated. The regional headquarters moved. When jobs leave a city, everything collapses behind them. Real examples. Take a city like Gary, Indiana. Median home price $72,000. Beautiful Lake, Michigan location. Why is it cheap? Because 60% of the population left. When? When the steel mills closed. Where did the jobs go? Nowhere nearby. So even if you buy a house for $60,000, you still need income. You need to work somewhere. If you're not remote, which most people aren't, you're either unemployed or driving 45 plus minutes to find work. Now your cheap house costs $200 monthly in gas. You're stressed. You're not building wealth. You're surviving. The migration reality. Young people leave cheap housing areas. They're not choosing to stay in declining cities. They're leaving because there's no economic opportunity. The people who remain are elderly, unable to move, or struggling. The community demographics shift. Schools lose students, lose funding, decline further. Businesses close. More people leave. It's a death spiral. Cheap houses sit in the middle of declining communities. That's not investing. That's catching a falling knife. Education and property values. Here's what real estate investors know. Home values track school quality. Always. Without exception. You can have a beautiful house in a terrible school district, and it will depreciate. You can have a modest house in a great school district, and it will appreciate. This is factual. Families with children, the demographic that builds wealth through real estate, will not buy in bad school districts. Period. The school funding problem. And here's the cruel part. Cheap houses are in areas where schools are failing because property tax revenues are low. The houses are worth less, so property tax collections are lower, so schools are underfunded, so schools get worse, so property values decline more. It's a feedback loop. You cannot break it as an individual investor. You cannot fix Detroit public schools by buying a $60,000 house. You're just trapped in a system you can't change. The demographic reality. So who buys cheap houses? People without school-age children. Retirees. Investors betting on neighborhood turnaround. But families? The demographic that actually builds communities and creates demand? They avoid cheap house areas because the schools are failing. Without families, there's no community renaissance. Without a renaissance, houses stay cheap. This is why revitalization is so rare. It requires simultaneous improvement in schools, jobs, and safety. Cities can't just lower housing prices and expect people. They need to fix fundamentals. The uncomfortable truth. Population decline creates crime. Declining cities have higher crime rates. This is an opinion. This is data. And most people, when evaluating where to live, make decisions based on safety. They're not making pure financial calculations. They want to feel safe in their neighborhood. They want their kids to be safe. They don't want to worry about property crime or violent crime. The crime property value cycle. High crime drives down property values. Low property values attract investors hoping for turnaround. But without addressing the crime, turnaround doesn't happen. Crime doesn't solve itself. It requires community investment, policing, economic opportunity, things that cost money and time. So the cheap house you buy sits in a neighborhood where you need cameras, security systems, and you're still worried about break-ins. That's not wealth building. That's stress. The resale problem. Here's where it gets brutal. You buy a cheap house in a crime-heavy area. You renovate it. You spend $15,000 improving it. You try to sell it. Nobody buys it because it's in a crime-heavy area. The location hasn't improved. Your improvements are worthless. You've sunk money into a property you cannot resell. You're now a landlord in a neighborhood you don't want to live in, renting to people because it's the only option, dealing with tenant issues because the neighborhood attracts troubled tenants. This is why cheap houses stay cheap. The deferred maintenance crisis. When cities decline, infrastructure fails. Roads crumble. Pipes corrode. Electrical systems fail. Water systems need replacing. These aren't cosmetic issues. These are foundational problems. You buy a $60,000 house. Looks fine on the surface. You move in. The roof leaks. The foundation has cracks. The electrical system needs updating. The plumbing is corroded. You discover these slowly, expensively. You're looking at $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in repairs. The math becomes impossible. So now you've spent $60,000 on the house, $40,000 on repairs, and you own a property in a declining area. You invested $100,000 total. What's the market value? Maybe $75,000 if you're lucky. You're underwater. Meanwhile, someone who bought a $200,000 house in a stable neighborhood saw their property appreciate. You're losing money. They're building equity. This is why cheap houses don't attract serious money. The math doesn't work. Property taxes are brutal. People think cheap houses mean cheap property taxes. Not always true. Some declining cities charge high property taxes because they need the revenue. So you buy a $50,000 house. Property taxes are $1,500 annually. That's 3% of the purchase price every year just in taxes. Add insurance, maintenance, utilities. Your annual carrying cost is $3,500 to $4,000 on a $50,000 asset. That's a terrible return. Meanwhile, in a stable market, property appreciation might offset these costs. In a declining market, you're just bleeding money. The bigger picture. Population movement is real. Americans are moving from declining industrial cities to growing Sunbelt cities. This isn't random. It's following jobs, following opportunity, following growth. The census data shows this clearly. Cities losing population for decades. Cities gaining population. Cheap houses are in losing cities. Expensive houses are in winning cities. That's the pattern. The generational reality. Young people aren't staying in declining cities. They're moving to cities with tech jobs, with opportunity, with growth. The cultural narrative is often revitalize declining cities. But the economic reality is brutal. Cities without jobs, without growth, without opportunity are losing people continuously. You can't swim against that current as an individual investor. You cannot convince enough people to move to a declining city to reverse the decline. The asset depreciation problem. Even when you improve a cheap house, the property value might not increase because the neighborhood is still declining. You renovate. Market improves maybe $5,000. But the neighborhood depreciates $10,000. You break even or lose money. This is why flipping cheap houses is so risky. You're not just betting on the house. You're betting on neighborhood reversal. That's a losing bet statistically. The cash flow calculation. Maybe you're thinking, I'll buy the cheap house and rent it out. Let's do the math. You buy a house for $60,000. Monthly rent in that area? Maybe $600 to $700. You think that's cash flow, but you're carrying costs, Property tax $125 per month. Insurance $80 per month. Maintenance reserve $100 per month. Vacancy factor 10% of rent. Real monthly carrying costs $305. Net cash flow $300. That's $3,600 annually on a $60,000 investment. That's 6% gross return. Sounds okay. But here's the problem. The landlord problem. You're now a landlord in a declining neighborhood. Your tenants have limited options. They're living here because it's affordable, not because it's desirable. You get problem tenants, late rent, property damage, eviction battles, attorney's fees. You're spending $2,000 dealing with tenant issues, losing 2 months' rent because of turnover, getting damaged property. Your 6% return becomes negative. You're paying to own this property. The alternative. Meanwhile, someone who invested that $60,000 in an index fund is getting 7 to 8% returns with zero management, zero tenant issues, zero late-night phone calls about broken pipes. They're beating your returns while working less. This is why institutional investors don't buy cheap rental properties. The math doesn't work. The hassle doesn't justify the return. They buy in markets where rents support the investment. Cheap houses don't have rents that support the investment. The neighborhood feeling. Even if a cheap house made financial sense, people don't want to live there. They drive through the neighborhood. They see boarded-up buildings. They see abandoned lots. They see few people on the streets. It feels depressing. It feels unsafe. They feel the decline. It's not rational necessarily, but it's real. People vote with their feet. They leave declining neighborhoods. They avoid declining neighborhoods. You cannot overcome that with pricing. The social aspect. Community matters to people. They want vibrant neighborhoods. They want walkable areas. They want restaurants, coffee shops, social activity. Cheap houses are in neighborhoods without these things. Without critical mass, you can't support businesses. Without businesses, there's no vibrancy. Without vibrancy, people don't move there. Even if you buy the cheap house, you're living in a neighborhood that doesn't have basic amenities. That's genuinely depressing long-term. The cheap price doesn't compensate for the isolation. The perception problem. Cheap houses carry a stigma. People know that cheap houses are in declining areas. Buying a cheap house means you're admitting you can't afford anything else, or you're making a risky speculation bet. It's not seen as a smart financial move. It's seen as desperate. This perception affects resale. Agents struggle to sell. Buyers are skeptical. Everyone knows cheap houses are cheap for a reason. Nobody trusts the deal. Why house flipping fails on cheap houses? You see house flipping shows. Buy for $50,000, renovate for $30,000, sell for $120,000, profit $40,000. It works on TV. In reality, you're buying in a declining market. You renovate. You list it. Nobody buys it because it's in a declining market. Or they lowball you because they know the area is declining. You're stuck holding the property. Your holding costs, taxes, insurance, utilities are bleeding you out. You drop the price. You finally sell for $85,000. After realtor fees, you've netted $5,000 on $80,000 of capital for 6 months of work. That's a terrible return. The effort versus return problem. Flipping cheap houses requires constant work. You're managing contractors, dealing with issues, hunting for buyers, negotiating, managing closings. You're working 20-plus hours weekly for a $5,000 profit. You'd make more working a part-time job. This is why experienced flippers avoid cheap houses. They flip in stable/growing markets where the appreciation is there. They avoid declining markets where you're fighting the market fundamentals. Why cheap houses exist? Markets work. Prices reflect value. Cheap houses are cheap because they're in bad locations, bad economies, or bad condition. That's not a hidden opportunity. That's the market working correctly. The market is telling you, this is not a good investment. Most investors listen to the market. The few who don't and ignore the signals lose money. This isn't rocket science. It's basic economics. The rare exception. I'm not saying never buy a cheap house. I'm saying understand why it's cheap. If you can specifically address the problem, maybe you found a neighborhood in genuine early-stage revitalization with confirmed job growth and improving schools. Then maybe you have an opportunity. But that's rare. Very rare. Most cheap houses are cheap because the fundamentals are broken. You cannot fix fundamentals as an individual buyer. The legitimate scenarios. Here are the only scenarios where cheap houses make sense. First, you're buying your own home in a neighborhood you love despite low prices because of personal reasons. Family there, strong community ties, you work locally. You're not buying as investment. You're buying as home. That's fine. Second, you're buying as a true long-term hold, 20-plus years, in a neighborhood with genuine revitalization signs, confirmed job growth, new business investment, improving schools, population stabilization. You're betting on slow turnaround. That can work, but requires patience and luck. Third, you're buying severely undervalued property in a stable neighborhood, temporarily depressed, rare. Fourth, you're a skilled contractor who can add genuine value through renovation in a neighborhood that will appreciate. What doesn't work? Don't buy cheap houses hoping to flip them. Don't buy them as rental investments expecting decent returns. Don't buy them for appreciation in declining markets. Don't buy them thinking cheap price means value. Cheap price means something is fundamentally broken. Subscribe right now, because next week I'm showing you exactly where appreciating property is right now in 2026. The cities and neighborhoods that are actually gaining population, gaining jobs, and appreciating. I'm giving you specific zip codes and price points where smart money is actually buying. Comment below. Have you bought a cheap house? What was your experience? I'm reading every comment because I want to hear your real stories. Hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.